Welcome to today's show where we are going to be discussing how much to spend in overhead. Now, before I go into how much you should spend in overhead, I would like to first define what is overhead, because this is one of those accounting names that has different type of names depending on who you ask. So overhead is also called G&A, which is general and administrative expenses. You can also call it maybe just administrative expenses. And really what overhead is all those expenses that are not directly related with your day-to-day operations of a specific unit in your franchise enterprise. For example, these could be things like your salary. If you're a franchisee and you are not yourself running day-to-day shifts in a unit, but you still will receive a salary, well, that would be considered overhead because it's not directly related with the day-to-day operations of one of your franchises or one of your franchise units. Something else that could be overhead are things like office supplies, the type of cost that you do, again, in your particular office, not in the office supplies of the store. Like the store might buy, staples or glue or clips at the store level. That would be part of the day-to-day operations. That is office supplies for the unit. But if you have an office at home, or maybe you actually have a separate building, then whatever office supplies you spend there, that would be overhead. Also things like, for example, you may have a bookkeeper, someone that does all the books for your entire company. Well, their salary, whether it's salary or hourly, that would go in overhead. If you hire a handyman that may be doing overall general services, well, I guess if it's specifically a service for a particular store, then the cost will be assigned to that particular store. But if you have someone that might be hired for the month, for example, then that overall monthly salary would be considered overhead. Now, something else is, for example, you have a lawyer that you are paying a retainer for every month, or maybe an accountant that does your financials for your entire organization. Or let's say that as a multi-unit franchisee, you have a district manager. Well, that would also be considered overhead because, again, they're not attached to one particular unit daily operations. They're overseeing a district. And so this is a type of expenses that are considered overhead. Now, it doesn't mean that it's not going to be then put back in the unit. It just means that as you are attaching or doing accounting or bookkeeping for your overhead, all of these expenses are put together, and then you have to divide it among the stores as an expense for the stores, because it's an expense that you have to manage your units. And so some of the things that you need to consider when it comes to overhead are that whatever you spend on this overhead is going to come from the cash flow of your unit. So you need to be very careful as to how much you're going to be spending in overhead, because you might end up spending the entire profit of your organization. I remember when I helped, or actually one of the assignments that I had when I was in international, I went to support a master franchisee in Argentina for a global brand, obviously. And one of the things that I noticed when I first went into that office is that it was a very large office, considering the fact that they only had like 4 units open at that time. It was a newer franchise, but they had an enormous office with secretaries and bookkeepers and a team of 2 or 3 people in the training department, and they only had like 3 to 4 units. Clearly, the amount of overhead that they were already spending to only manage 3 to 4 units was enormous, and it would actually raise a big red flag immediately to me, because I had not seen in the time that I had been there supporting the master franchisee that they had a very aggressive opening plan. Like literally they didn't have any openings pending when I was there. So that's concerning, because obviously they're spending a whole lot of money in overhead, but they're not bringing in or opening enough units to support it and justify it. So needless to say, that franchise eventually closed down because they overspent their capital and they didn't have enough units to support it. And that's the mistake that I want you to avoid. You need to make sure that you do not spend too much on your overhead unless you are having the units built to support it. Something else to consider is that it is important that you, especially at the beginning when you're starting to grow your multi-unit enterprise, that you use as much as you can external resources. For example, if you're doing payroll, rather than have somebody internal doing payroll for you, you should hire an external company to do payroll for you, et cetera, et cetera. As much as you can spend in external resources so that the cost of your overhead is minimized and you don't have to bring a full-time person to do that particular job. Now, let's go back to the original topic of today's session, and that would be how much to spend in overhead. I will tell you that the overall general rule, and again, it's an overall general, actually not even a rule, it's a guide, is 5%. 5% of your total revenue. So you take all the revenue from all your units and you multiply it by whatever 5% by 5%. That should be the budget that you should use to consider what you're going to spend on your overhead. Now, this is a general guideline because if you don't have 5% profitability in your organization because you're having issues with the management of your business, when obviously you cannot spend 5%. So that 5% should be reduced. Really, that's just a beginning baseline for you to then determine what should be your budget for overhead. But this assumes that each of your units are making more than 5% net profit so that you actually have the cash flow to spend on this overhead. And so there's other things to consider. If you are an organization that is stable, that has already grown to where you're going to be, is stable, meaning that you're not aggressively growing, then you may need to be below 5%. You should be maybe at 3%, maybe 3.5%, maybe max 4%, because you're a stable organization. 5% is the average organization that is growing, slowly but surely, and you want to have the support to be able to do that growth. Now, if you're having an aggressive growth in your organization, then you're going to go over the 5% because now you are bringing in the people to help you support that aggressive growth. So you might go to 7, 8%. I've seen even up to 10% of your net sales, right, to be as a budget for your overhead. However, there's a few things that you also need to consider, and that's number one, do you have the capital to support that type of investment in overhead? And number two, are you actually meeting your growth goals that then justify spending that much money in overhead? Just think and consider that your goal eventually is, once your organization is stabilized, that you want to be at 5% or below. And again, all of that money is coming from the cash flow of your organization. Now, just because that is your overhead and you have a cost center where you are putting all these expenses in, that money is going to come from somewhere. So how this money is now accounted for is now it becomes a line item in your unit's profit and loss statement that says overhead or administrative expenses or G&A, whatever you want to call it, and you agree with your accountant what that line is going to be. And you know when you see that line, that's your overhead, right? Now, how this overhead cost is distributed among the units is your decision. You can either divide it equally among all your units, or you can actually divide it based on sales, right? So if you have a higher volume store, they may pay a little bit more for the overhead because you can say that it takes more overhead to support that store. Well, a lower volume store, it takes less effort because there's less people, less volume, less expenses, so you might need less overhead. You can do that, or you can simply divide it equally among your units, and that is how you're going to be looking at that expense in your units, because at the end of the day, it is a business expense. It just happens to be an administrative expense, but you still need to charge back that cost to all your units. So if you have any question about everything that I talked about here today as far as overhead, or if you would like to know more about how can you manage your overhead so that it can be minimized so that you can get the most profit out of each of your units, or if in general you would like to know how to manage your units so that you can maximize your profitability, so that not only do you have enough money for the overhead, but also plenty of it left over for you to make your profit that you want out of your business, I would like to invite you to explore some of our educational programs here at the American Franchise Academy, because our programs are specifically designed to give franchise leaders the knowledge, the tools, and the resources that you need to be successful. So with that, all you have to do is visit us at our website, AmericanFranchiseAcademy.com, explore the programs so that we can then help you not only be able to identify and define clearly what are the expenses that you should have, but also how can you make the most profit out of each of your units in your franchise. So with that, thank you for being in the show, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.